Today's video is about Bertolt Brecht and the play The Good Woman of Setzuan. Bertolt Brecht was born on 10th February 1898 in Augsburg, Bavaria, into a middle class family. From very early on in his life, Brecht was drawn to literature and theatre. However, things changed for him after the First World War. He had worked as a medical orderly during this Great War, and witnessing the harsh catastrophe that the war had brought in turned Brecht towards political radicalism. By the late 1920s, Brecht was living and working in Berlin, where he came under the influence of Karl Kraus. Karl Kraus was an eminent Marxist theoretician who had been expelled from the German Communist Party in the year 1926, and it was Kraus who gave Brecht a rigorous grounding in the Marxist thought. Brecht never formally joined the Communist Party himself, but he did incorporate Marxist principles deeply into all of his subsequent works. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, Brecht decided to flee Germany almost immediately as he moved out of Germany in the February of the same year, so just 1 month later. His books were among those that were burned by the Nazi regime in the May of 1933. He spent his exile years first in Scandinavia, so in the Scandinavian countries like Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and then he moved to the United States where he lived from 1941 to 1947. And in United States he did some Hollywood work as well, but it remained essentially marginalized. It was during the Scandinavian exile, that was from the year 1938 to 1941, that he wrote the play The Good Woman of Setzuan. After the war was done, he returned to East Berlin, where he founded the Berlin Ensemble in 1949, and he died in the year 1956. Brecht had spent 16 years in exile, but his years in exile were not merely a passive withdrawal. His exile was a politically active exile in which he remained faithful to the cause of the working class. Now, let's move on to a brief historical background of the play. Bertolt Brecht wrote the play The Good Woman of Shadeswarm between the years 1938 and 1941. Now, this was also a time frame when Europe was going through a period of extreme political violence and instability. Fascism had already taken hold in Germany and Italy. The Spanish Civil War had ended with the defeat of the left wing Republican side, and the Second World War had begun. Brecht was living in exile during this time, and he was watching Europe collapse from a distance. Because of all of this, the play is not just about one woman in a Chinese city. Shetsua becomes a way for Brecht to talk about the world that he actually knew that he was living in, a world that was being shaped by poverty, exploitation, war, and political cruelty. He uses this fictional setting to show how difficult it is to remain moral in a society where survival depends on money, power, and selfishness. Okay, so now in order to understand the place that Bertolt Brecht holds in the modern European drama, we first need to know where he came from and what he was reacting against. Firstly, we have writers like Henrik Ibsen, who gave European theatre social realism. His plays depicted real social problems like gender oppression, bourgeoisie hypocrisy, and hereditary diseases in a very naturalistic setting. Ibsen wanted the audience to identify with characters and feel the tragedy of their situation, as we have seen in A Doll's House or Ghosts. The world of the play felt like the real world itself. Then we had writers like Anton Chekhov, who went further into naturalism, capturing that surface of the ordinary life, the pauses, the mundane conversations, and the concealed emotional depths. His plays like The Cherry Orchard, Three Sisters, etc., they all invited the audience into an almost dreamlike immersion where you forgot that you were actually in theater. Then came the theatre of the absurd with writers like Samuel Beckett, Eugene Ionesco, Jean Genet, and they were writing mostly in the 1950s and 60s. The writers of the theatre of the absurd reacted against both realism and rationalism, and they staged the meaninglessness of existence, where language collapsed and action led nowhere, where identities were dissolved. Absurdist theatre also broke with naturalism, but its response to a broken world was existential despair and not any political action whatsoever. Then finally, we have Bertolt Brecht, and he is distinctively different from all the other three that we have discussed right now. Against Ibsen, he argued that individual psychology and moral tragedy distracts the audience from the structural cause. He says that you should not weep for Nora Helmer, you should change the social system that produces her situation. Against Anton Chekhov, he refused the emotional immersion that makes theatre feel like real life. He wanted the audience to remember that they were watching a constructed representation. Against these absurdist writers, Brecht rejected fatalism and meaninglessness entirely. He said that history is made by human beings, conditions can be changed, and theatre must be a tool for that change. Where absurdism says that there is no solution, Bertolt Brecht says that there is no solution yet, but we can find one. Another very important concept associated with Bertolt Brecht is that of epic theatre. Now, epic theatre is, in very simple terms, a name that was given by Brecht himself to a mode of theatrical practice that was built on rejection of what he called the dramatic theatre. So, there's this Aristotelian theatre or the dramatic theatre that has been continuing since Aristotle, and now in the modern times, Bertolt Brecht has invented a new kind of theatre that he calls epic theatre. As we all know that Aristotle in his work Poetics described the ideal function of tragedy as catharsis. So catharsis is the emotional purgation of pity and fear in the audience. When you watch Oedipus destroy himself, you feel intense pity and terror for him, and at the end you will feel cleansed and emotionally exhausted, and you will reconcile with the world basically. This reconciliation is what Brecht argued is politically dangerous. He says that catharsis makes the audience passive. They feel and then they go home relieved. The suffering on stage has been processed and discharged before people left the theatre itself. So, the social conditions that produced the tragedy of Oedipus in the first place remain unchallenged and unchanged. This is something that Brecht was completely against. Aristotle also described theatre as mimesis, basically imitation of an action. Good drama creates an illusion of reality so persuasive that you forget that you are in a theatre. You are inside the world of the play. Again, this is another point where Brecht argued that this was politically disabling. He says that if you believe you are watching real life, you cannot critically evaluate what you are seeing as a social construction. Epic theatre is a sequence of incidents or events that are narrated without artificial restrictions as to time, place, or relevance to a formal plot. The theater is designed not to hypnotize you but to provoke you to think and to take action. So, where on one side we had the Aristotelian theatre or the dramatic theatre, where the audience was supposed to feel, in the epic theatre, the audience is made to think rationally. In the Aristotelian theatre, there is this emotional identification that is created between the audience and the play, so the characters of the play. But in epic theater, the goal is to create critical distance between the audience and the characters of the play. So In the Aristotelian theatre, everything unfolds organically. There is a proper structure to the plot, like Aristotle said, a beginning, middle, and end. But in epic theatre, the episodes are presented in an informal order. They are very vague in a way. They are represented independently, so there is no proper structure or order or cohesiveness to the story, so to say. Again, in the Aristotelian theatre, we have catharsis. So by the end, we are purged of all the emotions that were produced. But in the epic theatre, the plays are often very open ended. So they leave the audience unsatisfied, and it is basically provoking the audience to think and to change the world. So take action basically. Because of this reason, the plays in epic theatre are not easy to understand in a way because they are not familiar to us. We have always been used to reading plays based on the Aristotelian model, and the model of the epic theatre completely disrupts that harmony. So, when we look at the play The Good Woman of Setzuan, we see that it is also a play that comes under the epic theatre division. So, what are some devices that are used in the play that make it a part of the epic theatre? The first would be direct address to the audience. So the play is opened by a character named Wong, and he comes in and directly speaks to the audience. He says that I am a water seller in the city of Shetswa. My trade is not an easy one. Now, with this dialogue, he is not speaking to any other character. He is narrating it to us like a storyteller. So the fourth wall is broken and the character is directly addressing the audience. This immediately establishes the epic theater mode. We are not watching life happen, we are being told a story and we are invited to judge it and take part in it critically. Then in this particular play, we also have a lot of songs that comes in as interruptions. So throughout the play, the action will stop all of a sudden, and then a character will start to sing a song. So we have the song of the smoke, the song of the defenselessness of the gods, and there's also the song of the water seller's oath, etc. These are not the songs that just fit into the drama emotionally, like we have the musicals sometimes in series or movies. These are not those type of songs. These are basically interruptions. They are pausing the drama. So they interrupt the drama, they comment on it intellectually, and then again the drama resumes. So there's this shift from the spoken dialogue to the singing verse, and this itself is kind of an alienating jolt that is given to the audience. And with this, Bertolt Brecht basically is able to maintain that critical distance between the audience and the play, so they are not able to relate with the characters as much. Another critical device of the epic theater is the episodic structure of the plays. So this play also, it consists of a prologue, then there are scenes, 10 scenes are there, and there are many interludes or sub scenes in between. So for example, if there is a scene 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So in between there would be scene 1A, so that is kind of an interlude in between, and then finally it ends with an epilogue. So there is no tight casual chain between each episode. Each of these episodes are functioning independently and almost as a separate parable that is illustrating a different aspect of social injustice. This structure is actively resisting the structure of the well made plays that Ibsen used to construct. Another important feature of the epic theater devices that we have in this particular play is the minimal or the symbolic set design, you can say. Now, Bertolt Brecht uses sparse and functional sets. There are very few objects and bare minimal lighting, and it is done in a way that clearly signals that this is a stage. This is not your real life. You should not relate to it or connect to it in any way. So there's no attempt whatsoever to create a realistic setting. For instance, if you would have read Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House, in the start there's this narration part where the narrator is describing the setting of the living room, and that living room is described down to every single detail. The time is around Christmas, so including all the details about the Christmas tree and the lighting and the furniture that has been used. So, very descriptive in nature. And that was done to make the audience relate to the setting, relate to the play. It was a kind of a setting that every single person in their room or in their homes would have. So people were able to connect easily. But in opposition to that, Bertolt Brecht is using the setting as a tool. So bare minimum objects and bare minimum lighting in his settings or in his stage, you can say, in order to convey this properly, that this is a stage, this is not your real life that we are putting up, this is something that you're not supposed to relate to, this is just something that you're supposed to watch and think critically about. Another important element of epic theatre devices in this particular play is that the scene titles, or the thematic summaries, you can say, are projected before the scene itself. So you are kind of telling the audience what is about to happen rather than maintaining any suspense whatsoever. In this way, you are freeing the audience to watch how things happen and not whether they will happen or they won't happen. There's no suspense that is maintained. Everything that is about to happen in the scene is already narrated beforehand. Finally, the last element would be that this whole play operates as a parable. So, what is a parable? A parable is basically an instructive story with a moral teaching at the end. But that is like a traditional parable. But unlike a traditional parable, in this play, we do not find any resolution. Brecht has not given us any proper resolution. It just poses a question and then leaves it to the audience to answer it. In fact, it is good to know that Brecht explicitly called The Good Woman of Setzuan a parable play. So, a parable is a short narrative that uses a concrete story to make an abstract point, right? Like Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan does not ask you to identify with the Samaritan, it just asks you to extract the moral lesson from it. And Brecht chose the parable form for a specific reason. Realism cannot do what a parable can do. Realistic drama presents the world as it is, with all of its messy peculiarities, and it invites you to feel your way into it. But a parable presents a simplified, a very clarified version of the world in order to make its argument visible. And by stripping away the psychological realism and the naturalistic settings, Brecht can make this abstract forces of capitalism, morality, divine authority, all of these as visible forces, not just the backdrop to individual suffering. However, the crucial difference, as discussed before, is that in a traditional parable, there is a clear lesson that you need to identify. But Brecht refuses the moral, he refuses to give a traditional ending to the parable. The Good Woman of Shetswa ends with the gods flying away, and the epilogue actor asks the audience, you write the ending, you find the solution. So, the parable form is used in this particular play, but not to deliver any prepackaged truth, you can say. It is rather used to pose a question that demands political action, and this is exactly the goal of the epic theatre. With this, we complete the first part of the lesson, which was to situate the text within its historical context and learn about the devices and techniques that the author has made use of in the play so as to understand it better. Now, in the next video, I will discuss the synopsis and the thematic concerns of the play. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.